This is Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Body with Dr. Schuyler. Discover how your thoughts manifest disease and what you can do about it. Here's your host, Dr. Schuyler.
Hello, beautiful souls. Welcome back. So, are you stuck in fight or flight? And what exactly does fight or flight have to do with anxiety and the disease process? So, how we deal with stress, it ignites this evolutionary mechanism of fight or flight or freeze. And a few episodes ago, we went over the frozen response. So today, what we're going to cover is, what does living in fight or flight look like? So, a brief overview. The limbic system is responsible for fight or flight, and it allows us to enter this survival state in the presence of perceived threats, or even the presence of actual threats or even psychological threats. So, while this response can be critical on how we deal with stress, you may have noticed on occasions when your heart's racing, or you felt flushed, or you felt like you're on high alert, as if you weren't in immediate danger, but you felt like you're in immediate danger. So we get stuck in this high cortisol levels. We begin to feel hypervigilant. And I like to describe it as, sometimes when you're stuck in this high cortisol, it feels like a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Wherever you move, whatever you do, you're going to get your tail squished. So you just feel like this sense of hypervigilance, always looking around you, always scanning the room for an exit. A common one that I see is not having your back face the door, like in a restaurant or somewhere, or you startle very easily. You might be quick to be annoyed, angry, irritable, and even frustrated are some examples of fight or flight, living with it daily. In addition to the heart racing, you may have racing thoughts, constantly scanning for anything that could possibly harm you or threaten you. A very common one is insomnia. It's really impacting the way that you sleep at night. And after you do fall asleep, you wake up in the middle of the night with racing thoughts and overthinking. Your stomach may churn a lot, a frequent need to use the restroom. A common one is just feeling completely exhausted all day long, even if you did sleep well the night before. It can be sweating, feeling hot, and I have noticed that people become very sensitive to noises and lights. It all just feels like it's just too much sensory input. And another example is panic attacks, or this sense that you can't breathe, you can't catch your breath. You may feel like you're not able to get a full breath in, or you may have even developed a fear of vomiting or a fear of choking. And all this forces you to want to avoid your emotions at all cost. If you crave extra salty foods, extra sweet foods, you've noticed that your face is getting bloated. That's levels of high cortisol in the body. Or your abdomen is swollen. Or your energy may spike randomly, and then you're unable to wind down. And sometimes this even can happen at nighttime. When it's later at night, you're supposed to be settling down. All of a sudden, boom, you get this massive surge of energy and you can't fall asleep. An extreme response is actually something called psychogenic fevers. When you get so overwhelmed, you're in this fight response and you can't react, and our body gets so hot, we develop these fevers which have no organic medical reason for them. And heart arrhythmias are also very common with the fight response. So the fight or flight response, you can kick in any time, even when there's no threats around. And it's usually it occurs in people who've experienced a traumatic event, psychological abuse or emotional abuse, or even in this state of dysfunction, whether it's family dynamics, school dynamics, a partner, or social media. It's some form of dysfunction that's entered into the person's life. And they may not even be aware of it or not, that they're in this chronic stress response, either from school or family demands, or especially motherhood. Go, 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 go. And if you're not busy, it's like a sense of failure. It's, oh my God, I'm so busy. And it's this guilt that if you're not busy, you're doing something wrong. And any sort of like unhealthy relationships and any form of dynamics that can take place. the body gets stuck in this chronic, prolonged stress response. So if our minds are in limbic, our bodies are in limbo. So the body is a physical representation of the subconscious mind. So if the mind's in flight, the body's going to be in flight. So what's really responsible for this? And it's in part called the amygdala, and I like to call her Amy for short when I'm explaining it to my pediatric patients. And for any of the Swifties out there, this is a no relation to thank you, Amy. But the amygdala is the emotional center of the brain. It's part of the limbic brain. So the Amy is responsible for attaching emotional content to memories. So it's responsible for things like fear, anxiety, and aggression. It's basically the lizard part of our brain, our primal survival instinct. So we are not meant to live in this primal state. It's only supposed to occur in small bursts. And a good way to understand this is if you could imagine a smoke detector. So a smoke detector can't tell the difference if you have burnt the toast or the house is on fire. The smoke detector is going to go off either way. Amy can't tell if you're imagining the house is on fire or if it's burning down. So if you think of it, the way amygdala responds to fight or flight, it either wants to run away, fight it, or freeze up. It can't tell if you're imagining it or it's actually happening, the same as a smoke detector. So this fight or flight is activated when it responds to perceived stress and the heart rate, blood pressure, the concentration. So in theory, yeah, this is good. We need to be able to hyper-focus on a bear chasing us. It's meant for something bad. But what's happening is we're having this intense, repetitive, prolonged locking into this fight or flight state that lingers for days, months, and even years. Think about PTSD and the Vietnam veterans. Years later, they're still experiencing PTSD, a fight or flight response. So this can last for years when the mind is in limbic, the body is in limbo. So, there's a serious acts like the war and acute traumatic events like car accidents, natural disasters, and very unfortunately, mass shootings, or just even, the sudden death of a loved one. And what's really not talked about is, what seems more benign is being around emotionally unavailable people. We've talked about this before, the chronic invalidation, where someone tells us, or you begin to feel like you're not worth someone's truth or time or energy, or you just start to feel like you're regret, you're mistaken people's lives. I always hear kids say to me, I just feel like an emotional burden to my parents, where their emotions are bad juju. And what happens oftentimes is children, even think back to your own childhood, or even with a partner or a coworker at school, anywhere, where you have this urge to fight back. You want to use your voice. You want to run and get away, but you can't. A kid can't yell at their parents and get away with it to some extent, what they've done. Kids learn to stuff it down. You're in an emotionally safe environment. You're not going to scream at your boss how angry he or she just made you. You're going to shove it down. If you're with an emotionally unavailable partner, you can't express emotional pain, so you drown in it. So back to more of the extreme examples, you're in a car accident, you might have flashbacks about it. You might avoid wanting to get into cars. You might experience physical or mental fight or flight symptoms. You might be trembling, you might be shaking, you might get hot, you might get really cold, these racing thoughts. Even if you're not near the vehicle, you're experiencing this form of PTSD. But I want to look at the side that no one really acknowledges or talks about, the emotional side of PTSD. And there's actually a term getting coined for this. It's not in the DSM yet, but it's gaining some traction. And it's called, when I use this word, I'm going to mean more globally. It's called post-infidelity stress disorder. And that doesn't necessarily mean cheating in the traditional sense. It could also be you feel emotionally betrayed by a coworker, or you feel emotionally neglected by a loved one. It holds the same contextual meaning when you feel betrayed by someone. So the term is PISD, but I want you to think of it in terms of fight or flight. If you're chronically experiencing this sense of emotional neglect, the sense of emotional betrayal, you're going to activate fight or flight. If it goes on for too long, you become frozen. But when you're in environments when you can't use your voice and you stuff it down, the body gets stuck in this. And, I like to always use these examples. And I had a patient and she left a toxic relationship. And I've mentioned it before, how serious broken heart syndrome is. And it's just a series of unfortunate events which leads to, and there's a physiological science behind this, which leads to a chronic fright response, your inability to use your voice and inability to express anything. So she was in her 30s at the time. So when she goes to express her emotional pain and she was attacked for it, her voice made things worse. So this increased the emotional abuse, and she actually developed something called broken heart syndrome. There's no way to communicate the despair. People who often have grief, their loved ones die, people married for 30, 60 years, their partner dies, they get broken heart syndrome. So when you feel the sense of deep emotional betrayal, this form of like emotional PTSD or emotional PISD, your heart actually begins to change. So she was actually hospitalized for broken heart syndrome. And when you look at the science behind broken heart syndrome, the tendons that connect the heart, the fibers, actually begin to break. And the heart starts to change shape, and the heart begins to pump blood less efficiently, and the arrhythmia starts to happen. So when she was conveying to the human, hey, I've got this heart condition, I'm in the hospital, it was completely an unhealthy relationship dynamics. It's your fault. You've got this heart condition. You got venom in your heart. That's why you're having it. So what's happening is she has this need to express herself, finding out about these numerous behaviors that were very unhealthy. And when she spoke, she got further emotional abuse, further emotional neglect. But if she fights back or expresses it, it gets worse. So look at the science behind broken heart syndrome. You're stuffing your anger, you're stuffing your pain, you're stuffing your grief. And broken heart syndrome is real. So she's laying in the hospital bed. She can't talk. She can't vent. She can't yell. She's enraged with nowhere to express it. She's stuck in a fight response, isolated, chronically invalidated, emotional abuse, no way to express it. So with the evidence showing that broken heart syndrome is real, there's even more evidence to double down on that. This new study shows that our heart has this little brain in it that tells the brain memories. So the heart is literally communicating up to the brain emotional memories, physical memories. We have 3 brains in our body. Our brain, our gut is second, and our heart is third. Our heart stores memory. So any sort of when you feel invalidated or you have this rage you can't express or emotional abuse or cruelty at work or invalidation at home, the heart memorizes this and then shares that memory with the brain. So if you think back to your childhood, if you ever felt any sort of emotional betrayal as a child or emotional neglect, your heart memorized that. In an environment where a child can't run, they can't express their needs because, like that woman who was laid up in the hospital, expressing her needs made things worse. The abuse increased. So you have to just stuff it down. When you can't speak your pain, it gets trapped. So when you start working on releasing pain from the heart, releasing grief, and I've had patients have lost multiple loved ones in their life, and all that grief gets stored in the heart, and their body gets stuck in fight or flight. And one way to work it out, and I worked it out with this patient, is to start writing bugger off letters. In order to start releasing this anger, this fight response that you're in, or this grief flight response, trying to avoid the pain, It starts by writing out these letters to let it out or creating hard boundaries to create a sense of safety. And the broken heart literature, shows that if you protect your peace, you start nurturing yourself from inside. Remember, we can't heal the same place we're being harmed. Screaming into a pillow, hitting pillows, crying, journaling, all of this begins to release the trapped anger stored in our hearts and in our cells. So it may never be safe to communicate to your parents. It may never be safe to communicate to your partner. It may never be safe to communicate to your boss. But you can actively start doing things to start getting yourself out of this chronic state of fight or flight. The energy gets trapped in the cells. And being in this chronic state of fight or flight, your reaction becomes habitual. This begins to become this default mode network of defensiveness or long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs, or scanning the room to run away to get out. Over time, we talked about this a little bit in previous episode about the frozen response. You can become emotionally numb. When you're in a chronic state of fight or flight and you feel overwhelmed, you experience this emotional bluntness. You get on this autopilot and you are continued to expose yourself to this environment, especially people in chronic states of trauma or invalidation. And this becomes a constant reminder that you are stuck and that you're getting more and more numb, more and more reminder of the environment you're in. Another sign is you're tired, but you can't rest. This 2023 study by the Sleep Foundation found that 54% of participants cited stress or anxiety for the number one reason why they couldn't fall asleep. They were stuck in fight or flight. So a common symptom we talked about is hypervigilance. And this is when the mind and body are on alert to stay in survival mode because any given moment, a bear can break down and rush into your bedroom and harm you. So these sleep disturbances cause this muscle tension. And this muscle tension causes these biological changes. And that can induce nightmares, waking up too early, restless sleep, restless leg syndrome, sleep talking, sleep walking, sleep eating. So this chronic exposure to cortisol, this stress hormone in the body, puts us in this state of hyper-awareness, which causes the fight or flight. But what's fascinating, as this extends even into periods of rest when we're supposed to be sleeping and the nervous system just cannot shut down to get calm enough. So since stress can lead to functional and structural changes in the brain, it also impacts memory. You may get brain fog. A lot of people cannot remember their childhood. They're like, I don't understand why I can't remember my childhood. What is that? Did something happen? I blocked it out. And it's not necessarily some major traumatic event happened to them. They were probably living in a chronic stress response, and the memories cannot form when you're in a chronic stress response. No new learning can occur when we're running from a tiger or a bear. So during this process, this cohesive narrative of a traumatic event may be lost if there was a traumatic event. The brain can't put it into memory banks. There's nowhere for it to be compartmentalized. So our brain stores information about the event in other ways. It might remember the scent or the physical sensation or visual cues. Sound is another way that our brain can remember. So we can't physically remember the event, but if you smell something, it might cue you and remind you. So repressed memories often happen when the trauma is so severe that the conscious memory can't be stored. However, elements of the memory can trigger fight or flight. So what happens is this cohesive narrative, it's not typically stored. So it goes unprocessed. Unexpressed emotions create disease in the body. Unprocessed emotions and memories trigger a fight or flight. So what seemingly is unrelated things pop up: a smell of a fragrance, a certain taste of a beverage, a disapproving facial expression might ignite this anxious state within, a traumatic or displeasant memory, gets carried over into the current situation. So these small inconveniences make you burst out in anger, and the feelings of anger are normal, but misplaced anger can be a sign of chronically stressed state. A dysregulated emotional state can be an example of chronic fight or flight. So, since emotions like anger, anxiety, and fear trigger fight or flight, your body is trained to react almost immediately, even in situations where your feelings are misplaced. Like you might have a knee jerk reaction to someone's, hey, did you make you a cup of coffee? Oh my God, to make a cup of coffee. Why did you want me to make you a cup of coffee? They might get this rapid speech. They might have excessive defensiveness, this disproportional reaction to a seemingly benign question or event. That often is signs of a fight or flight response. So, how a person copes with trauma or even just copes with chronic invalidation or unhealthy attachment or unhealthy environments, it differs person to person. I think it's something like 20 people can go into war zone, and I think 8 come out with PTSD. It's something along those lines. So it's really dependent on what your lifestyle was like previous to the event and what other internal factors shape whether you get in this chronic fight or flight, which can turn into this PTSD or this emotional PTSD. If you're avoiding or engaging in situations that might cause stress, you're stuck in fight or flight probably. You might be trying to stay away from circumstances that cause stress. I see this all the time in kids trying to avoid school. Panic attacks, avoid school. You might be avoiding people, places, situations, anything can prompt certain memories or certain physiological sensation. This is a survival response that people avoid places and experiences that are reminiscent of previous unpleasant experiences. So this is your body's way of keeping you safer, trying to utilize avoidance, flight, trying to run away. So, conversely to that, the other side of the pendulum, and this is what I find so fascinating working with trauma, is some people choose to surround themselves with similar situations, almost to like an unhealthy degree. It works in the opposite way. So some people gravitate towards situations that are intentionally triggering. And this is a subconscious way I call trying to close the trauma loop. We recreate childhood traumas in our adult life in order to reconcile for them. I'm going to repeat that. We recreate childhood traumas in our adult life in order to reconcile them, in order to close the loop, in order to gain a sense of control, in order to gain a sense of validation. So we will surround ourselves with people and places that will recreate this trauma wound of fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of failure. That keeps us addicted to the trauma, keeps us addicted to the cortisol. Emotions are highly, highly addictive. Cortisol is highly, highly addictive. It's not just only contagious, but it becomes addictive. These dopamine hits, these lows, these fighting to get back the dopamine hits. So we recreate and position ourselves in these scenarios to relive something we're trying to resolve, but all we're doing is staying in a chronic fight response or flight, causing disease. The saying is the type of parent you are is the type of partner you are. And if you're an anxious person, you're probably attracted to an avoidant person. You're recreating the childhood trauma over and over again. So whether you're trying to avoid the stressful situation or trying to gain control over it, the memories remind you of previous experiences. So your brain's living in the past, and the past limbic response, the past fight or flight, and you're remembering it. So you're in a current fight or flight, even just by remembering it. Or if your heart is sending memories back up to the brain. Past memories create current limbic. Past memories create current limbic. So when you're reactive in situations you normally aren't, you have this emotional bluntness or these quick to snap, very snappy behaviors, very defensive behaviors, very volatile, disproportional reactions. Difficult to regulate anger, sadness, shame. Shame's a really hard one to regulate for someone who's in a chronic fight or flight response. It becomes almost this intangible concept to be able to process. And small inconveniences, other people needing you or other people asking something of you or questioning you makes you burst into anger. Now, albeit obviously anger is a very normal process. It's a very healthy process. I'm a big advocate of expressing anger. But when it becomes misplaced, if you're in a chronically fight or flight stress state. So like anger, anxiety, fear, the body almost responds immediately. So if you find yourself snapping really fast, being very reactive, it's maybe a fight or flight response. And ask yourself this question when you're jump scared. How do you react when you're jump scared? Do you react? Do you want to punch the person in the face? Do you want to run away? Or do you freeze? Another question I like to ask people, it's one of my screening questions, and I'm asking someone what limbic response they're in without directly asking them what limbic response you're in. I say, when you get cut off by a car when you're driving, how do you react? How you react when you're cut off, when you're triggered unexpectedly, oftentimes tell you if you're in a fight or flight response. Do you want to scream the person out, cuss, yell? And we've all seen the road rage episodes. Or do you just kind of want to hurry up and get away from the person, like get away, run? Or do you just like, oh my God, what do I do next? Or sometimes I get cut off. I'm like, yeah, I've done that too. No problem, buddy. I got you. So this flight response is this need to escape. It's sweeping things under the rug, ignoring life's problems, ignoring your emotions, don't want to talk about your emotions, don't want to think about your emotions. You may be having panic attacks. People who are in a flight response are chronic overthinkers. Overthinking is underfeeling. Overthinking is stuffing emotions. I see most common with overthinkers are GI disorders, GI distress. When you have diarrhea, think your stools are running, your limbic is running. Flight response often is in IBS or diarrhea symptoms. Anger response is unexpressed, usually heart palpitations, chronic widespread pain, joint problems, inflammation. In a couple of episodes, I'm going to have this is one of my favorite patients who has mast cell activation. That's often a fight response. Skin eruptions, fight response. UTI, reproductive, fight and flight responses. So anger and fear stores, especially in our heart, broken heart syndrome. We begin to change the way our heart chemistry looks, the way our heart structure works. It's shooting these memories up to the brain, recalling, hey, this hurts. It's literally storing in our 25 trillion cells. And we're having automatic negative thoughts. I'm not good enough. I can't get anything right. You have 48,000 roughly negative thoughts a day. This is storing in our two other brains, our heart brain and our gut brain. Gut is the second brain. The gut has 100 million nerve cells that line the digestive tract from the esophagus all the way down to the rectum. So this gut system is called the second brain, because it helps with digestion, but it also alerts the brain when something's wrong. Gut response, intuition, hairs on the back of your neck. That's your second brain talking, stores memory, emotions, anger, flight, fear, IBS, GI. There's 500 million neurons in the GI tract. So it's so unique to think about this, that our body operates independently from our brain. Our gut tells us something's wrong. It goes and tells the brain something's wrong. The heart says, hey, I remember this. This is painful. You need to either fight back or run or freeze. Migraines are a great way I like to describe. It's the person usually is feeling intense anger and rage inside, and they're avoiding it, and they express in the outer world they're feeling something different. So migraines and headaches are usually you're feeling one way inside, but you're expressing the world something different. And I notice this with POTS as well. You're feeling something inside, but you're presenting the world, everything's fine, everything's okay, I'm okay, but inside this bubbling rage. So your mind may not know, but your body is telling you. So What symptoms do you have? When you look at the polyvagal theory, above the diaphragm is fight. Think cardiac. Below the diaphragm is flight. Think diarrhea, run, avoid. Non-organic, non-medical reasons for migraines and cluster headaches is incongruent. It's a mix of fight and flight. How we're feeling one way is different how we're expressing it out to the world. So how do you calm the fight or flight? Well, you deactivate the limbic system. That's the first thing. You can't heal in the same place for being harmed, even if it's within our own environment, our own body. So I actually do have a workbook that goes in line with this that's online now, that if you follow the podcast in conjunction to the workbook, it's going to start teaching how to deactivate the limbic system. And I actually do have a workshop coming up to teach people how to deactivate the limbic system. But what do you do now? My favorite go-to is ice water exposure, putting your face in ice water. You only need 11 minutes a week to deactivate the limbic system, start noticing things different. Walking outside on the earth is a really good way to deactivate it. Writing in your journal. Writing, moving. Think you want to move the energy that's stored in the heart. You want to move the energy that's stored in the cells. You want to start moving this trauma out of your body. And if you truly do believe like you're stuck in a fight or flight, I definitely recommend seeing a therapist, because what you don't want to happen is that you're going to have some traumatic memory and make things worse and actually get sicker. I did mention I do have this online workshop coming up, and it's actually going to be called Deactivating the Limbic System, how to move out of limbic response to a more healthy response. That's going to be on the website, and it's October 5th right now. I also have a retreat coming up, and it's going to be in person in October. And this is going to be going over all the things that we're talking about, where the science and psychology merge, and how to deactivate the limbic and make yourself feel better. You can find it on the website at drskyler.net. But if you want to learn a lot about it, I've created this podcast in order to start explaining to people all these different variants of where science and psychology meet. So I've got 2 books coming out, and it's Empower Yourself to Heal. And then the second book is Empowering Your Child to Heal. And it's talking about these 8 ways that merge science and psychology, and what's the interplay between the two of them that causes anxiety, that causes GI disorders, which causes autoimmune. And it talks about the fight or flight response in great detail. If you want to learn more about it, again, it's drskyler.net. I'm finally on Instagram, drskyler_, and the same handle for TikTok and on LinkedIn. And if you want to even get deeper into it, I've got on the website previous interviews that I've done with like Achieve TV and different podcasts, where I really start getting more into specifically what causes the disease process. And I thank you all for listening, and have abundant blessings and a beautiful day. Thank you. Thank you for your time. I feel so grateful you have listened to the end. When we begin to understand how our body manifests stress, trauma, depression, anxiety, and even unexpressed emotions, we then create a space and bandwidth in our minds to begin to heal our bodies. Healing is a decision, and I am grateful for yours. Abundant blessings, Dr. Schuyler.
To learn more about the work Dr. Schuyler is doing, please visit drskyler.net. That's drskyler.net. And remember to subscribe to this podcast wherever you like to listen.
Produced by Audavita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.